Welcome to Pollinator Paradise, how to attract pollinators to your landscape. Today we're going to cover why pollinators are important. We're going to meet the pollinators and talk about what they need for habitats. And then at the end, we'll do Q&A. So at about 12:50, we'll start the Q&A and end with a survey. Okay. Oops, hold on. Whoops. Sticky keys. All right. The first thing I want to cover is why are pollinators important? Well, pollinators and really all insects are critical to human survival. We would not be able to live without them. Famous E.O. Wilson, a biologist and naturalist, estimates that we could only survive a few months without insects on our planet. And so pollinators, it's easy to understand because they help provide our sources of food. But there are also many millions of other insect species and a lot of other benefits that insects provide humans. Today we're focused on pollinators, and to start with, 3/4 of pollinators on our planet, 75% of plants on our planet require pollinating insects or animals for plant reproduction. So really, pollinators are the foundation of our ecosystems. And for humans, they're also critical for us too. About 1/3 of the world's crops depend on insect pollinators. And a lot of that's going to be the most nutritious part of our diet. So vegetables, fruits, and nuts. A lot of our grains are winds pollinated, and they don't need insects. Bees pollinate up to about $15 billion worth of crops each year. And it's more than just our fruits and vegetables that are dependent on pollinators. If you think about it, cows feed on alfalfa and clover, and alfalfa and clover are pollinated by bees. So everything is very connected. It turns out about 87 crops are dependent on pollinators. And the honeybee plays a critical role in crop pollination and our economy, but then there are other crops that are dependent on other pollinators. So some have specialist relationships with their plants. So a great example are bumblebees. Bumblebees do something called buzz pollination. They have a specific vibration, and when they land on a plant, that vibration is enough to release the pollen out of the plant. No other bees can do buzz pollination. So great examples of plants and crops that need buzz pollination are tomatoes, peppers, and blueberries. So without bumblebees, we would not have tomatoes and peppers, or we would have to hand pollinate them, which would be very tedious work. Some tomatoes and peppers can self-pollinate, but overall, bumblebees play a critical role in pollination of those crops. Our cactus, there are cactus bees, and cactus bees have a very specialized relationship with cactus. So other bees may forage on cactus flowers, but really cactus bees are critical in the pollination of cactus. And same with squash bees. Who doesn't love squash and pumpkins? Well, squash bees are the most efficient pollinators of squash and pumpkins. In fact, we probably wouldn't have squash and pumpkins without them. Squash bees enter the flowers very early in the morning. They're very efficient, and by the time the honeybees wake up, the squash bees have already pollinated all those flowers. So I encourage you, if you're growing squash and pumpkins, to go out in the early mornings and look in the big open yellow flowers. You'll see some squash bees pollinating those flowers. And then another unique relationship is the yucca moth. So yuccas can only be pollinated by yucca moths. One cannot survive without the other. So we have a lot of specialist relationships. A lot of our other pollinators are generalists, meaning they can forage and pollinate a variety of things. And what happens when our crops are not pollinated? Well, here's some pictures to share. In Insufficient pollination leads to poor fruit development. So what exactly is pollination and how does it help the plant reproduce? Well, in a nutshell, a bee or other pollinator lands on a flower to collect pollen and nectar. Now, bees are collecting pollen and nectar. Pollen is protein for growing bees, and nectar is sugar, which equates to energy. So the bee, for example, lands inside the flower and is going after the pollen and nectar reward. Now, at the same time, pollen grains are landing on the body of the bee or pollinator. And then the bee leaves that flower to fly to another flower. When it lands on another flower, those pollen grains from the previous flower are deposited inside the new flower. And that creates pollination of the plant. So the plant is able to reproduce, so to produce seeds and set fruit. Pollinators can cross-pollinate, which means they take pollen from one plant to an entirely different plant of the same species, or they can help the plant self-pollinate, which means they are delivering pollen from one flower to another on the same plant. Now, plants have special mechanisms that they can only accept pollen from the same species. So different grains of pollen from different species would not be able to reproduce. Okay, so that's pollination in a nutshell and how our plants reproduce. Now we're gonna switch gears a little bit and we're gonna meet some of our pollinators. So first, we're gonna talk about hummingbirds. Well, here in Colorado, we have 4 main species. The most common species by far are the broad-tailed hummingbirds. We see those quite often on the Front Range and in the mountains. We also see the rufous hummingbird. That's another common species. Normally we see our hummingbirds starting about mid-April. So it's time to get those hummingbird feeders out there because they are here. There has been sightings. But rufous hummingbirds we generally won't see until July. And that's because on their migratory pathway, they tend to go up the west coast first, and then they hit Colorado back on their migration down to Mexico. We have 2 other species that you may see in Colorado. The calliope, and I hope I'm saying that right. It's a little less common, but they're pretty cool because they're the smallest bird that migrates in North America. You may also see the black-chinned hummingbird. They are less common and they tend to breed on the west slope. So hummingbirds migrate. They migrate down to Mexico and areas of Guatemala for the winter. So when they get here, they're hungry. They're looking for your pollinator-friendly plants and the hummingbird feeders, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Other common pollinators are butterflies. Here in Colorado, we have about 250 species of butterflies. We have a variety of species. I've listed some of them. Some of the butterflies are migrants. 2 common, very famous migrants in the United States are the painted lady and the monarch butterfly. Now, the painted lady will migrate. It tends to be further south in like Mexico and southwest Colorado. Now, and then as the weather changes to spring and summer, they will have multiple generations moving northward once the plants start blooming and everything up north. Now, you may have noticed we've had a couple of years where the painted lady population has exploded. It's wonderful to see so many painted lady butterflies. The reason for that is all weather dependence on the southwest parts of the United States. On years where the southwest part of the United States gets a lot of rain, there are a lot of flowers and the painted ladies are able to reproduce a lot down there. And then once migration starts, all those butterflies come up to Colorado and move up north. So very cool. Another migrant that we see is the monarch butterfly. Now monarchs, Colorado technically is not along the migratory pathway. The migratory pathway for monarchs is more in the Midwest of the country and also the West Coast. So, however, we still see monarchs in Colorado. You tend to see them in the late summer, and they are quite a sight to see. And we have a variety of other butterflies. If you're curious about what butterflies live in your area, in your county, in your state, I encourage you to check out butterfliesandmoths.org. That is a collection of photographs of butterflies that have been recorded all over North America. And you can actually look and see how many species and what species of butterflies and moths are in your state and county. All right, we have a lot of other pollinators. I'm going to dive into bees here in a little bit, but I want to acknowledge some of the other pollinators that we have here in Colorado and the United States. Wasps. We have certain species of wasps that will pollinate. The photo in here is actually a special type of wasp that pollinate penstemon flowers. A lot of wasps are not pollinators. Some of them will visit flowers for nectar, but wasps tend to not have any hair, so that doesn't make them very, very good pollinators. I do want to mention wasps get a bad rep sometimes because we have a couple of nuisance species of wasps, specifically the European paper wasp and the Western yellow jacket. But I want to let you know we have hundreds of thousands of species of wasps in our country, and the vast majority of them are doing their own thing. They're in our backyards. They're solitary. They want nothing to do with humans at all, and they really serve an important role in our ecosystem because they feed on pest insects. So don't let nuisance wasps get in the way of planting pollinator habitats. If you have nuisance wasps, we can certainly help you manage that a little bit. And another thing to note about wasps, wasps are carnivores. They are likely going to feed on carrion, so dead meat or rotting meat, or caterpillars and insect pests. And so they really do serve that important role. Bees, on the other hand, only feed on pollen and nectar. So they're sort of the vegetarians of the pollinator world. And we'll talk a little bit more about the differences, but wasps can be pollinators. Flies. We have a lot of species of flies that are pollinators as well. Some very common flower visitors. We're going to talk about the differences between the two. Sometimes they mimic bees and wasps, so they're a little tricky to identify, but they definitely can be pollinators. Beetles are common flower visitors, and some species can also be pollinators. We see a lot of beetles on flowers in the late summer and early fall. This is a soldier beetle on rabbit brush. Rabbit brush is a great insect-friendly and pollinator-friendly plant. There's some species of moths that can also be pollinators. My favorite is the white-lined sphinx moth, which is pictured on the bottom picture of the screen. They have really long tongues, or proboscis, and so they tend to pollinate flowers. Moths in general pollinate flowers that are white and that are open at night, because moths tend to be nocturnal. This one is feeding on the columbine that has really long spurs on the petals. And bats. Bats are also very important pollinators. Here in Colorado, we have about 18 species. The species that live in Colorado and that live in Colorado are primarily insect eaters, another very important role for in our ecosystems. But other species of bats pollinate. One plant in particular is agave. Now, if anyone likes tequila, they should love bats because the pollination of the agave plant is how we have tequila. All right, so now I'm going to switch to bees, and I have a little more content on bees because we have such a wide variety of bees in our world. Worldwide, we have over 20,000 species. Here in North America, we have 4,000 species, and in Colorado, we have over 900 species. That is a huge amount of diversity that in many cases is right in our own backyards. So Colorado has a high number of species. How does that compare to other states? Colorado is pretty high, but look at our surrounding states. Bees tend to prefer arid and semi-arid areas. So California, Arizona, New Mexico definitely have us beat in terms of bee diversity. A huge number of species there. One thing to note is that states that have done a lot of taxonomic research on bees tend to have a higher bee diversity. And the reason for that is because they've studied it. So that means there are likely other species of bees out there in different states, maybe in our state, that may not have been documented yet. All right, and with bees, so with over 900 species of bees in Colorado, it's important to understand a little bit about their biology. So we have two types of bees that are, we call them eusocial or solitary. Now the eusocial bees, the most common one is going to be the honeybee. The honeybee is actually a non-native species of bee. We brought the honeybee over from Europe in the 1600s, but very, very common, and beekeeping is very popular. We know that honeybees live in typically man-made hives. There can be feral colonies, but typically they live in the man-made hives. And they tend to have three, eusocial bees, like the honeybee, have three characteristics that make them a eusocial bee. They have overlapping generations. So you've got some bees, the older bees that are raising the younger bees, for example. You have a reproductive division of labor. That means there's a queen bee, and she's the only one that lays eggs in the colony. And then cooperative brood care. So the honeybee is very altruistic. They're all about the survival of the colony. And so everybody plays their role, and depending on the bee's age, the honeybee has different jobs, and cooperative brood care is one of those jobs. All right, contrary to the solitary bees. Now, worldwide, about 10% of our bees are social. The other 90% approximately are solitary. Solitary bees live very different lifestyles. The only time they really interact with other bees is during mating. Otherwise, you have a female bee, and she is charged with finding pollen and nectar. She's also charged with finding a good place to nest. 70% of solitary bees nest underground, while 30% nest in cavities, which I'll show you some pictures of that here in a second. So she'll find a nesting spot, and she will bring that pollen and nectar to the nest. She packs the pollen and nectar into a tight ball and deposits it in the nest, and she lays a single egg on that pollen ball. We call it bee bread. And then she seals up that nest cell. That little baby bee, that one egg, has all the food it needs to become an adult bee. So the new baby bees will overwinter, and they'll go through the full metamorphosis, and then they will emerge as an adult bee the following summer. So they're very different lifestyles. So here's some examples. 70% do nest underground, so they prefer that bare soil, not too much mulch or anything. Other bees will nest in cavities, so tunnels. Sometimes they will utilize old beetle tunnels in a tree or a dead log. Some bees, like small carpenter bees, will actually excavate twigs, and the female will lay her eggs in a twig. So here's some photos of the life cycle. So you can see the larva on the bee bread, and then up in the upper left corner is a bee pupa. And then we have a special exception, and that is going to be our bumblebees. So bumblebees, we call their lifestyle primitively eusocial. And that is because they share characteristics with both solitary bees and social bees. So their life cycle is the queen bee, who is just the most hardy bees that you will ever meet. She will overwinter. So most bees will die at the end of the season. Solitary bees will die at the end of the season, but the new queen bumblebee will actually overwinter. She could overwinter underground. She might overwinter in a pile of leaves. She overwinters. She will emerge early spring. We're starting to see some queen bumblebees emerge, and she will forage for pollen and nectar. She will then find a new place to nest and start her colony. So a hollowed out hole in the ground is a great spot for a bumblebee nest, and she will lay her first generation of eggs. Throughout the season, she will have several generations of female workers. Towards the mid-season to late season, she will lay eggs that are females, and she will lay eggs that are new queens. Those males and the new queens, they leave the nest and they go mate with other bees, and then her current colony, once it gets cold, will die, but those new queens then that have mated will find a place to overwinter, and the cycle will repeat. So you can see how they've got the social characteristics of the queen and the colony, but they live underground, they have a 1-year life cycle, they've got those solitary bee characteristics too. All right, so now we're gonna meet some of the bees. So we have such a wide variety of sizes and shapes and colors that I wanna give you an idea of some of the bees that you will find in your own backyard. So, but first, normally if this was an in-person class, I would quiz everybody. But since we can't quite do that today, here's some tricky identification. So this is a game I like to call bee, fly, or wasp. Let's start in the upper left-hand corner. So the two photos most to the left, bees, wasps, or flies? Well, they are flies, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. The second two pictures, bee, wasps, or flies, they are also flies. Okay, here's where we get a little more complicated. The photo in the very top right-hand corner looks like a bee, looks totally like a bumblebee, but it is actually also a fly that mimics bumblebees. So, and this is getting tricky, so we're going to talk about why here in a second. The photo underneath that, that looks like a wasp. The abdomen looks like it has typical wasp markings, but it is actually a bee. And then the very bottom right-hand corner is a wasp. So why would flies mimic bees and wasps? Well, bees and wasps have the ability to sting. And so if a fly can mimic a bee or a wasp, it looks like it could be a stinging insect, and predators may avoid it. All right, so let's talk about how you know if you're looking at a bee, fly, or wasp. Well, wasps generally have no hair on them. They also have a pronounced constriction between their thorax and the abdomen, which you can see in the bottom left corner. Sometimes that's hard to see in the wasps, but it is a good characteristic to look for. Both bees and wasps have long antennae, but bee antennae are bent, and we'll see a picture of that. Both bees and wasps also have 2 pairs of wings, so that's not too good of a defining characteristic. But wasps will not be carrying pollen on them, where bees will have ways of carrying pollen on them. So other characteristics that you can notice, generally wasp bodies are long and narrow, where bees are a little more round and robust. Okay, so let's look at that. So you can see the long, narrow bodies, no hair, and sort of that pinched abdomen. All right, so now how do you differentiate a fly from a bee? Well, flies, they're a little bit easier. There's 2 characteristics that I think are easy to see when you're observing in your backyard. The first one is look at those eyes. So the eyes of a fly generally come all the way on top of the head, versus bees are going to be more on the sides of their head. So fly eyes are really good to look for. The other defining characteristic is their antennae. So fly antennae have just a couple of segments. They're very short, very stubby, where bee antennae and wasps too will have long antennae. Flies typically are not hairy, but we'll look at an exception, and they do not carry pollen loads on them. And flies hover where most bees cannot. So if you see an insect flying around your flowers and it's staying in one place in the air, likely that is a hover fly. All right, so here are two common flower visitors that can be potential pollinators. On the left two pictures, those are called bee flies. They get their names because they mimic bees. They are flies that have a lot of hair on them. So we see those a lot in Colorado, and they're common in the United States. The other flies that we see a lot are syrphid flies or hover flies. So those are the two pictures on the right. Very much they look like they look like wasps. Syrphid flies or hover flies are not only can they be pollinators, but their larvae of those flies will actually feed on a lot of pest insects. So they sort of give us a double benefit in our gardens. And then bee characteristics. First of all, they have four wings. Most bees are going to be hairy. And the eyes are large and on the sides of their head. Notice the bent antenna in that honeybee picture. They have two ways of carrying pollen. Honeybees and bumblebees have pollen baskets on their hind legs. We call those corbiculae, pollen baskets. And so you'll see round balls of pollen on their hind legs. Other native bees will carry their pollen on their hind legs or on the underside of their abdomen. They have special pollen collecting hairs on their body for that purpose. And then, you know, body shape, size, and color, it varies quite a bit, which we'll see. So, how do you know what kind of bees you have in your backyard? Well, I'm going to walk through 8 different categories. Now, these are large, broad categories. They are not taxonomic genera or species level, but they are broad categories that you can look for them in your yard. So, here are the answers to the quiz. So you can see why these are flies. They look at those eyes and the very short and stubby antenna. Where the bee, she's very hairy. She's got those bent antenna. She's got hair. It's a little hard to see in the photo, but she's got hair on the underside of her abdomen. And yeah, she's got sort of a more round and robust body. That is a wool carder bee. She's actually a non-native species, but very common. You see them a lot. They can be territorial and they might chase out other wool carder bees. You tend to see them on fuzzy plants because they actually will use the fuzz from the plants to build their nests. And then that bottom corner picture, right-hand corner, is a wasp. And you can see that long, narrow body, very little hair, and no pollen. Okay, back to the morphological species. I started a citizen science project back in 2016, and we used the morphological species for the citizen science project. But this is also a great key to use if you're just observing bees on flowers on your own. So on the right is a citizen science field guide. You will find this key and a lot more information about bee biology and bees that are in your area. So feel free to download it. I will also have this link at the very end of the presentation as well. So these morphological categories, there's 8 that we're going to go through kind of quickly. Honeybees. Honeybees are very common. We see them a lot. Backyard beekeeping is a big thing. They're medium to large bees. Notice the pollen buckets, those thick hind legs for pollen buckets. Very easily visible, usually. And they've got that fuzzy thorax. Then we have hairy leg bees. Now this group of bees, you can see some of the genus or the genera listed. There's a variety of species that fall into this category, but they all have one common characteristic, and that is they have special pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. So you can see how thick and bristly those hind legs are. They almost look like they're wearing bright yellow leg warmers. But these large bees, you can often see the pollen on their hind legs while they're visiting flowers. Then we have hairy belly bees. So this genus, or this group of bees, has a variety of genera too. They all tend to fall into the Megachilidae family, and these are our cavity nesting bees. So these are bees that are going to nest in our bee hotels, in nooks and crannies in a tree or a dead log, or in the twigs of certain plants. So all of these bees, their special characteristic is they have special pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen. And so that's how they get their name, the hairy belly bees. And so leafcutter bees are a great example of this. Leafcutter bees tend to stick up their abdomen a little bit while they're on flowers. So you can often see the pollen on the underside of their abdomen. Mason bees also fall into this category. And then we have bumblebees. Bumblebees are medium to large bees. The queens are especially large. These bees are going to have hair all over their body. So they're very fuzzy looking. And they carry their pollen in corbiculae. So those pollen baskets on their hind legs. Then we have striped sweat bees. So sweat bees get their name because they actually are attracted to human sweat. They sometimes can bite you. It's not too bad or anything, but these are smaller bees, small to medium, and you might see them in much smaller flowers. So look closely at the base of flowers, but their key characteristic is they're going to have stripes on their abdomen, black and white stripes, and they also carry pollen on their hind legs. But these bees are much smaller than our hairy leg bees. So look for those stripes and look for the pollen on the hind legs. Then we have tiny dark bees. Okay, so this is sort of a catch-all category for all the little bees that you need a microscope to really identify. Pretty much the vast majority of our bees, we need a microscope to identify to a genus or a species level. But if you're just observing bees outside, on your flowers, the tiny dark bee category is this catch-all for all those little bees that are flying around your flowers that you need a microscope to identify. But they do have a couple of key characteristics that you can sometimes observe, and that is they're generally going to be all black, but they still carry pollen on their hind legs. So look for that. They have other classic bee characteristics, the bent antennae, the eyes on the sides of their head. Some are metallic black and some are not. Some have yellow markings on their face, which is a little hard to see sometimes, but sometimes you can. But the pollen on their hind legs is a good characteristic. All right, this is a little bit of an easier one. We have green metallic sweat bees. So these bees are also very common. They are generalists. They'll feed on a variety of different things. In a lot of species, the female will be entirely metallic green, where the males will have a striped abdomen that you can see in the picture. So the key characteristics, they're green, metallic green, and they also carry pollen on their hind legs. These tend to be smaller and slender shaped bees. And then we have cuckoo bees. Now we have a variety of species of cuckoo bees as well. Now, cuckoo bees get their name because they are actually parasites. They, kind of like the cuckoo bird, they will lay their eggs in another bee's nest. And typically that means that the host bees will not survive. So every group of bee that we have, taxonomic group of bee, has a cuckoo bee that can parasitize it. So cuckoo bees are very difficult to identify because a lot of them don't have any hair on them. They don't need to have hair. They are not pollinators. They're parasitic and will feed off the food reserves of their host bee. So, but you will see them feeding on nectar on flowers sometimes. So key characteristics, very little hair. They don't carry pollen. I put two bees side by side in this slide. So on the left, you can see, well, actually on the right, you can see a leafcutter bee. You can see the little hairs on the bee. So that's the right is the leafcutter bee. And then on the left is the cuckoo bee that will parasitize a leafcutter bee. So they look very similar. You really need a microscope and some good taxonomic knowledge to identify a cuckoo bee to a genus or a species level. But they are here. I get asked a lot, are cuckoo bees responsible for bee decline? And the short answer is no. Cuckoo bees have always been here. They're part of the ecosystem, and if bee populations go down, the cuckoo bee populations go down. If bee populations go up, the cuckoo bee population will go up as well. So part of our ecosystem. All right, so we're going to switch gears and talk about pollinator habitat and how you can provide better pollinator habitat at your home. So we know pollinators are affecting, they have a lot of challenges ahead of them. They are facing habitat loss due to urbanization. They're facing parasites and diseases, pesticides, climate change, and quite often it's an interaction of all of these factors. So we should do our best to provide pollinator habitats for them. And the good thing about this is that everybody, no matter how small of a patch of dirt that you have, or not, maybe you don't have a yard at all, but you have a patio, everybody can provide food and habitat space for our pollinators. So just to give you an idea, about 82% of the population lives in urban areas, and that's just expected to increase. So that means our bees are losing a lot of the natural spaces that they would normally nest in. And so that's where we can provide nesting spaces and food resources. So pollinators, they need the same things that everybody else needs: food, shelter, water, and space. And so here's a look. We're going to start by talking about food. What kind of food do they need? So different pollinators need different things. So for example, bees tend to visit flowers that are bright white, yellow, or blue. Usually the shape of the flowers are tubular, and they'll have a landing platform. A lot of the markings on flowers are to attract bees and other pollinators to them. So bright white and yellow flowers for bees. Birds like hummingbirds go for scarlet, bright red, or orange flowers. They need large funnel-shaped flowers, sometimes some that provide perch and support. Butterflies will go for flowers that are bright red and purple. They have long tongues, and so they need flowers that have narrow tubes or spurs, and flowers that have landing pads on them that provide a place for the butterfly to land. And moths and bats tend to visit flowers, white flowers that are open at night. They tend to have a strong, musty smell to them, and we'll pollinate them at night because they are nocturnal. So when we think about food to plant for pollinators, we want to think about these things. We need a diversity of plants. Each plant has a different nutritional profile. So pollinators are going to get different nutritional benefits from them. So planting a diverse range of plants in your yard is going to be very beneficial for all pollinators. Flowers that bloom all season long. So from the very early spring to the very late fall, early spring blooms, catmint is a great option, crocuses are another great option, and late season flowers, rabbit brush is one of my favorites, and other goldenrod is another good one. Plants that will bloom all season. So that way they have food all season long. When you're picking out flowers, it's important to avoid double flowers. Now, a double flower is a flower that was bred by a horticulturalist for beauty and aesthetic reasons, and the plant has had the reproductive parts bred out of it. So those reproductive parts essentially become additional petals. So what you get is this big, bright, beautiful flower, and usually they'll last a long time, and they are stunning. However, they don't provide any benefits to pollinators or other insects. So the best thing to do when you're shopping for flowers is look and see if you can see those plant reproductive parts inside the flower. Another good tip is just when you go to the garden center, and I realize now we can't really go to our garden centers, but in your backyard or do research online, look and see what bees or pollinators are on what plants. That's usually a good indicator that it could be a beneficial plant for pollinators. And then there's a lot of talk about, are native flowers better than horticultural varieties? The short answer is native plants are always great for pollinators. That's what they have lived with. So you can't go wrong with native flowers. Horticultural varieties are likely really great for pollinators too. We know there's some that are awesome for pollinators. So the best thing to do is do your research for the area that you're living in to find out what plants are native or what are the best horticultural varieties that attract pollinators that will grow in your area. Here's a look at, these are some of my favorite native plants that are really great for pollinators. Rocky Mountain penstemon, they have the long purple tubular flowers that are, I see a lot of green metallic sweat bees in those. Blanket flower is a Gaillardia, is a great for many different types of species. We talked about rabbit brush. Rocky Mountain bee plant is another great one that you'll see all shapes and sizes, from little tiny dark bees to honeybees and bumblebees. Few others, harebells will attract, as campanula, will attract little tiny dark bees. Coneflowers will attract a variety of species and sunflowers. Milkweed has a lot of nectar, so not only is that great for bees and flies, but will also is a caterpillar host plant for the monarch butterfly. And then I want to mention Plant Select Plants. Plant Select Plants is Plant Select is an organization with Colorado State University and the Denver Botanic Gardens, and they specifically breed plants that will grow well in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. So a lot of them are low water needs type plants, and a lot of them are pollinator friendly plants as well. So I encourage you to look at Plant Select as an option for pollinator friendly plants. And here's some others. Blue Mist Spirea is a plant. It's not native, but it attracts so many bees. That's probably one of my favorite shrubs. Also Russian sage. Russian sage can get a little out of control, but it's definitely pollinator friendly. There are some trees that will attract pollinators. Linden trees. Now, if you're in Colorado, I caution against linden trees. They're great for pollinators, but they also attract Japanese beetles. So be wary about that. Catalpas, fruit trees, New Mexico privet are all really great for pollinators. And then, unfortunately, we have some weeds that also provide nectar for bees. Bindweed, unfortunately, is one of them, the never-ending battle with bindweed. So just a note, if you decide to spray for bindweed, clip those flowers first to make sure that the bees won't go into a flower that has been sprayed with pesticides. Same with dandelions. All right, so that's more about the food for all pollinators. I'm going to talk about some individual pollinators. Check the time real quick. Okay, butterflies. If you want to attract butterflies to your garden, the best thing to do is plant host plants for caterpillars. Caterpillars need that food. So in addition to the nectar, in addition to nectar plants, and each species of butterfly needs a different host plant for the caterpillars. So encourage you to do research. The example I have in the pictures are the two-tailed swallowtails. Now everybody has to help the two-tailed swallowtails because the caterpillars host on ash trees. We all know the emerald ash borer is coming, and we are probably going to lose a lot of our ash trees. So the other host plant for caterpillars for the two-tailed swallowtail are chokecherries. So chokecherries are great for pollinators and provide habitat for birds and food for birds too. So think about maybe planting a chokecherry plant. Monarchs, we know, host on milkweed. Painted ladies host on thistle. Black swallowtails host on fennel and dill, which is very common in our gardens. So each butterfly has a different host plant for the growing caterpillars. Otherwise, butterflies need open sunny areas, and they also need places to shelter from the wind. So planting a variety of trees and shrubs as shelter is also very helpful. All pollinators, of course, need water, so shallow dishes of water are helpful. If you see male butterflies in some wet mud, that's very common. They're collecting minerals that are in the soil. So there we have butterflies. Hummingbirds, keep in mind that hummingbirds, in addition to feeding on red flowers that provide nectar, they're insect eaters. So plants Provide plants that attract insects. Now, insects need nectar, so providing a variety of nectar plants or pollinator-friendly plants will attract insects and provide an additional food source for hummingbirds. You can also supplement with feeders, hummingbird feeders. If you do that, use a 4-to-1 ratio of water to sugar and get those hummingbird feeders out. And be sure to maintain it. Change the water, the sugar solution out every couple of days, keep the area clean, things like that. Hummingbirds also need places to shelter from like wind and storms. So a variety of trees and shrubs are great for hummingbirds as well. And then shallow water dishes. You can get like a planter, the bottom of a planter, and plug the bottom of it and place some rocks and a little bit of water, and that will attract all kinds of bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, and other insects that need water. Bee habitat. So if you're looking to provide bee habitats for our ground nesting bees, the best thing to do is provide bare soil. So just plain old Colorado or wherever you live soil, not too much mulch, no landscape fabric, nothing like that. They just need that bare soil for them to build a nest in. You can also provide cavity areas. Maybe leave a dead log in your garden, or maybe provide a bee hotel for those cavity nesting bees. You can also leave dead flowers that have hollow stems throughout the winter because there are some species of bees that might nest in those hollow stems. You can also consider reducing your lawn area. Lawns typically have no benefits to pollinators. There are benefits to having a lawn, if you like to recreate or have a picnic on your lawn, but reducing areas and planting pollinator-friendly plants and habitats can be of benefit. I like the term wildscaping. We instead of having a perfectly manicured lawn or landscape, having a variety of wildflowers and a little more like nature, a little more messy can be good. And again, the shallow water dishes are great for bees. Clover lawns may have an additional benefit to bees. Bees like to pollinate clover flowers. Clover also provides nitrogen to your soil and can be a less water, less maintenance, and less money way to take care of your lawn. They can also outcompete weeds, so something to consider. Here's an example of a bee hotel. I think this is just absolutely beautiful. Bee hotels are becoming more and more popular. If you decide to have a bee hotel, I would definitely do your research. On the right, this is a fantastic fact sheet that I encourage you to look up. It's out of Michigan State University. So if you type in Michigan State University bee hotels, it should come up. Because bee hotels, we want them to help the bees, not hurt the bees. And if bee hotels are not maintained properly, they can harbor disease, they can harbor mold and fungus and be a detriment to bees. So be sure to do research. Some few things that I want to point out: bee hotels should be at least 6 inches long and always have a backing. And you want to use materials like cardboard tubes, which you can find for sale a lot, or wood blocks. Wood blocks are also you can drill holes in them, different sizes for different species of bees, and that can be great for pollinators. You may also get some solitary wasps that nest in your hotel. Not to worry, these solitary wasps are great for our ecosystems and are not a nuisance at all to humans. So if you have more questions about bee hotels, let me know. And we're going to keep moving along because we're running short on time. If you want to keep learning about bees and other pollinators, this is my favorite book on bees. A really thorough guide to bees that live in North America and that you might see in your area. This is a great book for learning about how to attract pollinators and provide habitats. It's out of the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society is a nonprofit dedicated to invertebrates conservation. So they have a lot of great information. I left their website on the slide for you to note. The field guide, I mentioned this before. Feel free, our field guide is available on the Arapahoe County Extension website. which will be at the very end of the presentation. And use this. It's a great resource. It talks about bee biology and how to identify different types of bees. And then keep learning. I encourage you to visit the Colorado State University Extension websites. We have a variety of information on pollinators. If you're not in Colorado, you do have a local extension service. So look them up, give them a call. Here in Colorado, Colorado State University Extension is working remotely, so we are here to answer your questions. And I want to make an announcement about the Native Bee Watch Citizen Science Program. So typically, the Native Bee Watch Citizen Science Program has been an in-person project where we look at bees at public gardens. Since that is not an option, in the coming months with the pandemic, we are going to do citizen science at home. So all training will be virtual. We will teach you how to collect data, how to identify bees, and report that data to contribute to our research project. So if you are interested in getting involved, you can fill out the survey at the end of this presentation and put in your email address, and I will make sure you get that information. You can also shoot me an email too if you're interested in being involved. So our website, the Citizen Science website, is at the bottom. If you visit the Arapahoe County Extension website, you can navigate to it. All right, and I want to give a real quick one more shout out to Extension. We are here to provide science-based information to the community. My job specifically is in horticulture, so the resources I'm providing are written about gardening, yards, lawns, trees, and insects. But Extension also offers a variety of other services. If you're not familiar with your local Extension office, I encourage you to check out their website and give them a call. Please visit us. We are on social media, so follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're now going to place the survey in the chat box. So please fill it out. Let us know what other classes you would like to see, and any feedback is helpful to improving our class offerings. And now we will take any questions. Oh, excuse me. Okay, pulling up the chat box. Okay, so the first one looks like, are the rust-colored bumblebees a separate species, or are they a variant of a single species? So the rust-colored bumblebees, there are actually a variety of species of bumblebees that have the rust-colored on their abdomen. The most common one we're going to see around here is the Hunt's bumblebee. So it's got that bright rust-colored stripe on the abdomen. That's probably the most common bumblebee we see around here. So there are a variety of species though. The next question, are you able to send us the pollinator plant-like characteristic charts? We can post that on the Arapahoe County Extension website. Give me a little time, but that would be a great resource for, we'll post that on the Native Bee Watch Citizen Science page. So keep your eye out for that. Yes, arapahoe.extension.colostate.edu. Okay, so can you ID common flowers that are double flowers? Roses, dahlias, and I'm spacing out other species, but we can certainly get more examples of those after the presentation. Donna, if you want to shoot me an email, we can get that for you. Do bird fruit and non-fruiting fruit trees still provide pollen and nectar? I'm gonna write that down. I'm gonna have to look that up if the non-fruiting trees provide pollen and nectar. Trees. Okay, Erin, if you want to shoot me an email, I can get you that information. because I don't know that off the top of my head. Yeah, please fill out the survey. Okay, thank you. When do you recommend cleaning up your garden to remove dead flowers, etc.? Anytime now. You can wait. I'm personally going to wait a little bit longer. You can any time between now and mid-May. Usually that Mother's Day mark, mid-May, is a good time to clean up your yard if you're wanting to wait for overwintering pollinators to emerge. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, we are 1 o'clock on the dot, an hour exactly. Please, oh, it looks like we have one more question. I was unable to capture your plant list. Will this be available on the Arapahoe County site as well? We certainly can, but note the plants that I listed in my presentation are just a slice of what's actually available. So there are a lot of great plant lists out there for our area. So my list was certainly not a comprehensive list by any means, but we can make that list available on the website too. Okay, we will post the webinar presentation, but probably not the specific slides to download. That's part of CSU's policy, but we can post the specific, and I'll post a few slides of plants and the pollinator charts. And here, I will post the Arapahoe County website in the chat box too. Okay, all right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, there's a question about posting a leaf cutter bee link that you found. Sure, yes, please do. Okay, but if there aren't any other questions, thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Let us know if you have more questions, and have a great spring and summer. Thank you guys. And I'll stick around in case there are any other lingering questions. Okay, and please fill out that survey. Okay. All right, bye everybody. Thank you. Bye.